Peace and blessings to the 12 tribes of Israel. Today I'm going to deal with a topic called David and Goliath. David and Goliath. Right? This story has always been a fascinating story to me. And I thought I'd just do like a Bible share on it. And hopefully edify. It's pretty much just reading the story. And hopefully edify as I go along. Yeah. So let's find out what we can get from this. So let's go to 1 Samuel 17 and we're going to read from 1 to 58. Now the Philistines gathered together and their armies battled and were gathered together at Shokot, which belonged to Judah, and pitched between Shokot and Zakah and Ephas Damen. And saw the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. So Philistines would have been Hamites, I believe. So you had the Israelites and the heathen on the other side. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So he was a huge chap. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. He had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing a shield went before him, and he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, you servants of Saul? Choose you a man for me, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. 10. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of the Ephraite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 elders of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. Right, so David was the youngest of the brothers, right? But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Saul would have been the king, right? And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said unto David, Jesse was the father, unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of his parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of thy 1,000, and look how they brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. But David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion of the Philistines of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up? And it shall be that the man who killed him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. Right? So that would have been what would went out, right? That, if you defeat this guy Goliath, the king will give you his daughter, and you will gain great riches. And David spoke to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after his manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab his eldest brother heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why camest thou down hither, and with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? So he's saying, go back to the sheep, basically. I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, but thou art come down that thou mayest see the battle. Right, so you just come down to see the battle. That's all you come down here for. But David said, what have I now done? Is there not a cause? So as David said, is there not a cause for me to come down? So he's speaking to his brother. 30, and he turned from him towards another and said and spoke after the same manner. And the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spoke, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, but thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. So he's older than you, he's bigger, older than you, more skillful than you. He ain't going to defeat him. 34, David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, delivered it out of his mouth. And when he rose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and his uncircumcised this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he had defied the armies of the living God. Right, so he's saying he's gonna be like the sheep and the animals that I was controlling, right, that I slew. The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with you. So Saul said, all right, if you think you can fight this big geezer here, then go on, mate. But Saul armed David with his armour, and he put a helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armour, and he swayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David saw unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. So he's saying, well, I'm not used to this, so I'm going to have to take you off. 40, he took his staff in his hand, and he chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, even in its scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth. Right, so Goliath is staring down at David and going, you can't do nothing to me. Look, lad, you can't do nothing to me, mate. You just can't do anything, mate. But when the Philistine looked down and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and a fair countenance. Right? And the Philistine said unto David, am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. He's like, come on, mate. Yeah, come on, I'll break you. Feed you to the birds, the beasts of the fields. 45. Then said David to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defiled. 46. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smote thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, but the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So David is saying, yeah, I may look young, and I may look, small, considerably smaller than you, but be less experienced than you, but it's the Lord's battle, right? It's not my battle. And it came to pass when the Philistines arose and came and drew near to meet David, David hasted and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. But David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slung it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. Right? So so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and with a smote. Right? And smote the Philistine and slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. So he had no stones, but just one stone and a sling. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword and drew out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head. The Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof. I suppose that's the case. And slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted, pursue the Philistines until they come to the valley, to the gates of Ekron. And wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Shaaraim, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in the tent. And when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. And the king said, inquire thou whose son the stripling is. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Right? So David, it was the power of the Lord that actually defeated Goliath. Right? So it wasn't so much because David was more powerful than him physically, or even more experienced than him. It was just the Lord that was working through David, right? So let's now go to 1 Samuel 18, and we're going to read from 10 to 21. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with the hand as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. Saul saw the javelin, for he said, I will smote David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him and was departed. So the Lord by this time had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from him and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. So the Lord was always with David, right? Because he had wisdom, right? He loved the Lord. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. So Saul was afraid of him because the spirit had left Saul because of his disobedience, right? The Most High asked him to do something. He didn't do it. He did his own thing. And therefore, the spirit left him, right? God's spirit left him. So he had no power. But the Lord's spirit was with David, right? Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he went out and came in before them. And Saul said to David, behold, my elder daughter, Harab, her will I give thee to wife. So remember, it says earlier on, it said that if you defeat Goliath, the king will give his daughter to wife, right? So let's read. Will I give thee to wife? Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul said, let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said unto Saul, who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? Right? So David is like, should I be son-in-law to the king? But it came to pass at the time when Harab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel the the Mehalathite to wife, right? So Merab was given to somebody else to wife, right? So let's read on to 21. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the name of twain. So he said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll give him Michal, right? So let's go to 1 Samuel 18, and we're going to read from 24 to 25. And the servants of Saul told him, saying, on this manner spake David. And Saul said, thus shall ye say to David, the king desireth not only dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines, right? So now Saul is like saying, well, hey, in order to get her, you're going to have to work. You're going to have to work, my boy. All right, so let's read 24 again. And the servants of Saul told him, saying, on the manner spoke David. And Saul said, thus shall ye say to David, the king desireth not only dowry, you're not only paying me a dowry for my daughter, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged of the king's enemies, right? But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So he basically wanted the Philistines to kill him, right? Because that's a tall order, right? So let's drop down to 27 to 30, and then we'll close. Wherefore David rose and went, he and his men, and slew the Philistines, 200 men, and David brought their foreskins, so not just 100, he brought 200. And brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass after they went forth that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. So Saul was, he had demons on him basically. And he saw David as being his rival because the spirit had left him. The God spirit, Holy Spirit, had left him, and it was definitely with David. So he saw him as being more of a rival, right? So he kind of promised one daughter but took it back, and then the other daughter really liked David, and then he gave him a very, very hard target to meet, and David met that twice. He instead of 100 Philistines foreskin, he gave him 200. So Saul didn't have a choice. He had to give over his daughter, right? But I find it was a very, very beautiful story of David and Goliath, but it shows that just because someone is bigger, stronger, probably a bit more educated than you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will always overcome. Because if you have the Spirit of God, if you have the Spirit of God in you, you have the Spirit of Christ in you, you can overcome. With God, all things are possible. That's what the scripture says. Brothers and sisters, I hope you were edified. Shalom.